In 2022 we reviewed the NZXT H7 Flow. The original H7 Flow was fine, but we ran into some issues with the more expensive H7 Elite. NZXT H7 Elite, proof, if we need it, that no, you cannot flow air through glass. It's just impossible. When you look inside the original H7 Flow, you can see it has a conventional main compartment, complete with the power supply cover. However, this new H7 Flow has been completely opened out. Just look at that. Airflow directly for your gaming graphics card. So let's see how the new H7 Flow performs in our full review. Let's begin with the basic H7 Flow rather than the H7 Flow RGB. Listed at £120, I found it on sale here in the UK at £110. The white version has a clear glass tempered side panel, which simply pops off. As you can see, glass is completely clear. The front I/O is on the top. Power button, we have two Type A's, a Type C and a headset jack, and the top panel is tool free. Takes a very light push and it comes off. Front panel, simple pull. You'll note there are no separate air filters, we're relying on the mesh to collect dust. The right hand side, it's a plain panel here, perforated in the rear, comes away, and those perforations line up with that drive plate where you can install two 3.5s or two 2.5s, and below the power supply. When I turn the case like that, you can see the power supply stands upright, therefore it's relatively slender, and that means there's plenty of space in the main compartment because the power supply is inside this bulge. While we're around the back, we have another drive cage, specifically for two 2.5-inch SATAs, so a total of 4 drives. In the front we have 3 NZXT F120Q fans. The cables daisy chained together, so you only have one PWM connector for the 3 fans. But those 3 fans are conventional separate units, so if you choose you could take one from the front and move it to the rear. There are only 3 fans, but there are many more fan positions. You can install 3 140s or 3 120s in the front. In the roof, you can install 3 120s or 2 140s and a 120 or 140 in the rear. In the floor, in this recess section, you can install 3 120s. There's no option for 140s in the floor, so that is a total of many fans. You will note we have a cable management plate there, so if you're installing an ATX motherboard, the cables can be nicely out of sight. By eye, if you install eATX, that cover will have to come out. And around the right hand side we have plenty of hook and loop straps for the cables, so all the cabling routed there, nicely out of sight, along with the power supply itself, leaving the main compartment nice and free. Okay, that's the H7 Flow. What about the RGB version? And here is the H7 Flow RGB. Obviously this is black rather than white, and that means the tempered glass panel is lightly tinted. As I recall, the original H7 Flow a couple of years ago had much more heavily tinted glass. This is an improvement, but apart from that, the case itself is the same as the non-RGB version, except the fans at the front are RGB, of course. They default to white until you have the software to control the fans in operation. The 3 fans at the front of this case are not 3 fans. It's one unit that equates to 3 fans. This is the F360 RGB, which we first saw at Computex. Available in 3 forms. The F240 RGB core costs £40 here in the UK. The F280 costs £45 and this 360 costs £60. And the elegance of the system is that you install one single unit, just 4 screws required. There's a proprietary connector which goes off to the control unit, so you haven't got to worry about 3 voltage or PWM connectors, and 3 RGB connectors. While this will undeniably make life easier for the home PC builder, I suspect the main customer for the F series of fans is actually system integrators.
If you're looking for a new chair, then you should definitely check out Booley's. I'm currently sat on their Ninja Pro gaming chair, which is one of 3 models from their gaming series alongside the Elite and the Master. So if you're looking for something new to stick in your setup that you can sit on and game and work, then I recommend definitely checking out boolies.co.uk.
I'm going to use this white H7 Flow for my review because you can see what's going on inside the case so much better than you can with the black RGB version. Thankfully, NZXT sent me a bunch of hardware to go in the case. Let's start with this power supply, the C1500 Platinum. Alan reviewed this power supply recently, sells for £300 here in the UK. He loved it to bits. I also have this F360 RGB core in white, so I could, if I choose, switch out the 3 fans at the front for these, and magically the case becomes a white H7 Flow RGB. Not sure whether I'm going to do that. This is, after all, a review rather than a featured build. I also have the F360 RGB core in black, so I could, for example, put these in the floor of the case, put these in the front, move one of those 3 fans to the rear. Plenty of options. For the moment, I think I'm going to keep things simple, and I'll work around this Kraken Elite 360, which is most likely going to go in the roof of the case. However, I think we will play with a few options when it comes to cooling to see just how well the H7 Flow works. Step 1 is the motherboard assembly, and I'm using an NZXT N7 Z790, or I suppose NZXT N7 Z790, but we don't roll that way here in the UK. That is the motherboard, and it's a perfect match for the H7 Flow. For the processor, Intel Core i9-14900K, and in with the CPU. SSD is a Sabrent Rocket 4 Plus, off with the magnetic heatsink cover. In with the SSD. And back on with the cosmetic cover. For the memory, Kingston Fury Renegade DDR5 6000. And I think visually that's a perfect match both for the motherboard and also for the case. Lovely job. And now it's time to install the motherboard in the H7 Flow. And I have to say, that looks pretty good. Next up, it's the power supply. 1500 watts of platinum rated power. So let's get that. Oh my God, those cables. That's a heavy bag of cables. So let's get the power supply and the cables in the case. I'm using a 12 volt high power connector for the graphics card. If I want, I could have connected a second 12 volt high power, but I have no need. 2 EPS connectors for the CPU. I've got an 8 and a 4 on this motherboard. 24 pin main power. And I've added SATA just in case I have any peripherals that require it. Right, in with the power supply, with the fan facing outwards because the panel is ventilated. And it's at this point I note the case doesn't have any feet, which means that getting the screws in the power supply at the bottom is slightly awkward. And done. I need to connect up the cables. And once they're in place, it's time for the CPU cooler. I've added a Thermalright contact frame to the processor and motherboard just to help along the cooling a little bit, and then we turn to the chosen CPU cooler, Kraken Elite 360 from NZXT, which is this. And as you'd expect, it's a 360mm AIO with a display on the pump. The fans are non-RGB, they're PWM controlled. By eye, they look much more like airflow fans rather than air pressure fans to me. That gives me a modicum of concern about how this cooler is going to perform. But even so, let's start off with the stock fans, and afterwards we'll consider whether we need to swap them out. As we have fans in the front of the case, it makes sense to install the AIO in the roof. That brings me to a point about this case, which is that the fan rack in the top is fixed in place. I much prefer a removable fan rack so you can install your cooler or fans on the rack on the bench and then plonk the whole assembly in place. But we're going to have to go old school, so let's see how that looks. That's the cooler installed, and let's take a quick look, shall we? Neat installation. Loads of space in the main compartment, obviously graphics cards still to come, that's why we have the 12-volt high power cable flapping around in preparation. And if we go around the back, you can see the cable management is working very neatly. So let's install the graphics card. Gigabyte GeForce RTX 4080 Gaming OC. As you can see, this is a full-size chunky 3 or even 3.5 slot RTX 4080. And yet it vanishes inside the H7 Flow without any difficulty whatsoever. I'm never entirely sure if the power cable looks better connected like that up at the front of the card so it goes across the fans, or going across the back plate. I'm going to go with that option, and now it's time to do some thermal testing. Before we get busy with thermal testing, we're going to take a look in the BIOS. We've updated to the latest version and we've enabled XMP, so the memory is running at DDR5 6000. The other thing to check is the power limit for the processor. We don't want to overpower our Core i9-14900K, so we've set both PL1 and PL2 to 253 watts. We're running a combination of Cinebench R23 and TimeSpy Extreme Stress Test. At the wall socket we're pulling 730 watts, the processor as explained 253 watts, and our RTX 4080 325 watts. The 3 case fans at the front are set to 900 RPM and the 3 fans on the AIO liquid cooler set to 1000 RPM. As you can see on the Kraken pump LCD, we have a graphics temperature of 65 degrees and a CPU temperature of 73 degrees. We don't quite understand where NZXT's CAM software gets that figure from. However, we can see Intel XTU reports the CPU package temperature at 85 degrees, and that seems far more plausible. And we can see those figures in our chart. Graphics 65 degrees, CPU 85 degrees. For our next test, we swapped out the fans on the Kraken liquid cooler for the new F360 RGB core. These look more interesting than the original fans, and with them running at the same 1000 RPM, they sounded like this. But how did they perform? The ambient had crept up to 19 degrees. The graphics temperature was 66 degrees, which is accounted for by the increase in ambient. And as you can see, the figures from the first test run have been adjusted by 1 degree for that very reason. However, the CPU package temperature had jumped to 94 degrees. That was a surprising step up and strongly suggests the original Kraken fans are absolutely fine. We persevered with our RGB experiment and installed an F120 RGB core fan at the rear of the H7 Flow. With the fan running at 1000 RPM, the system sounded like this. The ambient had again crept up by 1 degree, so now it's at 20, so we've adjusted our figures again. Graphics 66 degrees, so effectively a 1 degree drop. CPU package temperature 95, in other words unchanged from the previous test. The bottom of the case deserves some attention, so we installed a second F360 RGB core unit in the floor of the case, and it looked absolutely superb. With the fans running at 1000 RPM it sounded like this. but when it came to performance there is very little change. The ambient was still 20 degrees Celsius and the graphics were also the same at 66 degrees. NZXT's CAM software reported a drop in CPU temperature of 3 degrees, however Intel XTU reported a drop of 1 degree. For our final test we swapped out the 3 stock fans in the front of the case for yet another F360 RGB core unit. This looks absolutely great and completes the RGB picture. The ambient is still 20 degrees and we see a reduction of 2 degrees in the graphics temperature, however the CPU package temperature is unchanged. You may have noticed that my review of the NZXT H7 Flow kind of became also a review of these NZXT F360 RGB core fan units. And there's a reason for that, as I'll come to when I get to the cons, my negative points. Let's address the pros, the good points of the H7 Flow. Number 1, huge amounts of mesh and loads of airflow. In essence, this case is open, and I'm certain that that is the explanation for those temperature charts of mine. It almost doesn't matter what fans you add, there's so much airflow inherent in the case that provided you have a decent cooler, particularly on the graphics card, your cooling is going to be absolutely fine. Secondly, the panels are easy to remove and building inside this case is easy. And third, you have excellent cable management, loads of hook and loop straps around the back and plenty of space for the cables. Cons, the negative points. None of these mesh panels have an air filter. Over time, I have no idea how dirty it's going to get inside this PC, but I suspect it will get messy. Secondly, and this is where my reference to the fans comes in, you need to use plenty of hardware inside the case to avoid it looking empty. There's so much space below the graphics card and you have that empty cavity at the bottom. If you don't pack it out, it just looks daft. And finally, the top fan mounts, it's not a fan rack. You just get mounts in the top of the case. So to build in it, you really want to lay it down, put the cooler in place, screw it home. Holding hardware up and going in at the top, slightly awkward. But that's a relatively minor point. Overall, I like this case. I like the price. It's an 8 out of 10. It's a worth buying.